Evil is real. On today's Playing with Fire, I'm going to dive into a topic that you've probably seen in the headlines, Satanism. Now, we've all got preconceived notions of what we think Satanism looks like. But here's the interesting thing. As we look at the headlines around us, for instance, the Pennsylvania school district that's allowing the Satanic Temple, a Satanist group, to host a back-to-school event, there's probably a lot of questions that you might have about what this particular organization believes, and that, of course, begs that broader question, what do Satanists believe? Do they believe in Satan? Do they worship the devil? What does it all mean? With all these stories in the headlines, we've got a lot of questions. I know I have questions, and so with all of the sort of influx of information and the confusion that has come with this, I've decided to dive into the core beliefs and practices of Satanists. As Christians, it's important to understand what this means so we have a real grasp not only on the stories around us, but obviously the theology that is driving some of the individuals who might call themselves Satanists. So let's start with the baseline definition of Satanism. Merriam-Webster offers two meanings. The first is, quote, innate wickedness. And the second is, quote, obsession with or affinity for evil. Now, we know that from Scripture. We know what the Bible tells us about Satan and about evil. But these definitions don't fully explain what Satanism is in the modern era. And here's why. It's become a bit of a complex enigma. You actually have two different schools of thought within the Satanist movement. And again, I want to underscore how important it is to understand this. As a journalist, for me, understanding when I see a story that the Satanic Temple or some other group is doing something, I want to understand what those people actually believe. Now, the first school of thought is an atheistic one. The second school of thought is a secularist one, okay? And there's really sort of a third school of thought then, which is a theistic one. Now, we're going to get into all of this. The atheistic and the secularistic could basically be combined into one. And so we'll go with the secularist, and then we'll look at the theological Satanists. This will all make a lot of sense as I break it down. But I want to just, before we even get into that though, at the start of the show, like every show, I say three words that are so important. Evil is real. And I want to underscore the fact that the Bible speaks explicitly about Satan, about evil, about stories of possession and healing. They are present throughout the entirety of the biblical narrative. We see evil manifesting itself in the Old Testament. We see it playing out in the New Testament. We are told in Ephesians 6 that we are in a battle between good and evil. This is something we cannot deny. It's something we have to understand. Now, with all of that said, let's go into atheistic Satanism. What is it? Now, all of those headlines we're seeing about Satanists who are creating after-school clubs and getting into all sorts of other antics, one of the groups you will see, and I already mentioned this group, it's the Satanic Temple. Now, the organization's website has a number of images that you would associate with Satanism, but as you dig into the core tenets of the Satanic Temple, it actually becomes clear that they're really self-professed atheists. They don't claim to believe in a higher power. They don't claim to believe in Satan or worship Satan, which might seem counterintuitive. If you look at the organization's frequently asked questions section, there's actually a question, do you worship Satan? And here is the organization's response. I want to read it to you. They say, no, nor do we believe in the existence of Satan or the supernatural. The Satanic Temple believes that religion can and should be divorced from superstition. As such, we do not promote a belief in a personal Satan. To embrace the name Satan is to embrace rational inquiry removed from supernaturalism and archaic tradition-based superstitions. Satanists should actively work to hone critical thinking and exercise reasonable agnosticism in all things. Our belief must be malleable to the best current scientific understandings of the material world, never the reverse. So the Satanic Temple doesn't believe in Satan. They don't believe the devil is a real-life being, as Christians would, right? Now, the Bible, of course, affirms Satan's existence in our world, but the Satanic Temple goes on to say it believes, quote, undue suffering is bad, and that it sees blasphemy as, quote, legitimate expression of personal independence from counterproductive traditional norms. So you can unpack that however you want, but really, it's interesting because some of the members of the Satanic Temple might apparently choose to get involved in certain rituals, but they're not required. There's nothing prescribed by the organization. And I bring that up because a lot of times with Satanism, we hear about these rituals, we hear about these things that are unfolding, but apparently some do celebrate the quote-unquote Black Mass, which celebrates blasphemy, or they engage in unbaptism ceremonies. And an unbaptism is basically a ceremony to undo a baptism. If you were baptized as a child and you embrace this sort of belief system, you would then go through an unbaptism to undo what your parents did when they baptized you. So I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole too much, but it is interesting. So to sort of summarize all this, the Satanic Temple and other organizations like it, they fall under what we call rationalistic Satanism, that's the term they use, or atheistic Satanism. And rather than an actual worship of Satan, they look at his attributes and really they sort of admire those attributes, but generally believe he's not real. Now, that is a radical departure from what we know about theistic Satanism. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit, but I want to get into some of the root, I guess the modern roots of contemporary Satanism. How did we end up with a Satanic Temple? How do we end up with these atheistic groups? Basically, this goes back to the 1960s. We can see that Satan is obviously a historical and theological figure. We see him throughout Scripture. We believe as Christians, again, he's real. But this sort of movement we see today, it started with the Church of Satan. It was founded in 1966 by Anton LaVey. And it tends to be seen as the beginning of the modern Satanist movement. And the Satanic Temple, the organization we just talked about, that didn't come until 2013. So that's a relatively new Satanist organization. But as we talk about LaVey, now the Anton LaVey, again, the founder of the Church of Satan, there's a lot of organizations here, but he was apparently a former carnival worker. He wrote the Satanic Bible in 1969, and that laid out the beliefs and church rituals of the Church of Satan. And it's intriguing because the Satanic Temple and LaVey, both of them share in the idea that they didn't worship Satan as a live being. So even this earlier group, the Church of Satan, they saw him as a, quote, symbol of humanistic values, according to Encyclopedia Britannica. So again, similar, the beginning of this Church of Satan, the beginning of the modern day Satanist movement, very similar to what we see in the headlines today. But there were some occultic practices, allegedly, and rituals that were part of LaVey's shtick, okay, from what we understand. Now, there's some debate around that, it seems, but it was quite limited, whatever was included. And I bring up the occultic practices because if we're talking about atheistic, right, Satanism, you would assume there would be no occultic practices. But here's the interesting thing. Without going down the rabbit hole of chaos, the Church of Satan started to have some splintering in the 1970s. There were some new groups that came off of LaVey's group, and it seemed like the debate was actually a split between the rationalists and the occultists, right? So you have this group that doesn't really believe that Satan exists. They're not worshiping Satan, but you start to have a split between people who want to practice the occult and people who want to be atheistic. And some people were apparently persuaded that Satan does exist and that he is here, right, in this realm, and that he is a real being. And so there were some splinters that came off of that group. And today, some of those differences persist. The Satanic Temple actually details some of their own differences with what they call LaVeyan thought. And again, LaVey was the founder of the Church of Satan, right? So even though they have some similarities, they have some differences. I won't get into all of them here, but it is interesting. So there's a lot of debate in the Satanist realm. And there have been some other groups that have emerged that apparently borrow from both the rational and the theistic. So these are people who would actually start to embrace some of those theistic worship of Satan, an actual being, believing that he exists. The outlet Bitter Winter actually covered a number of these organizations, and so you can look that up if you want to read a little bit more about, who are these people who believe in Satan or maybe borrow from both. But it's very, very interesting because this brings us then into the theistic Satanism. And as Christians, this is what we're more familiar with. These are the people who actually worship Satan. So those who adhere to theistic Satanism believe the devil is real and they revere him. Now, it's interesting, the Gospel Coalition wrote about this a while back, and they said, quote, "Theistic Satanists believe Satan is one of a group of suprapersonal dark forces capable of having some control or influence over human beings and who venerate, worship, or align with him." And so there are a number of organizations that would fit in this. One is the Order of Nine Angles. It's an occult group that was founded in the 1960s in the UK. They are reportedly still around. There's a lot of drama around this particular group. There are claims of associations with some nefarious organizations and belief systems. And, again, I won't get into all of that here. But the idea here, and again, some of the details are murky, is that there is a real focus on evil and opening up supernatural. And then there's Luciferianism, and this is a belief that venerates Lucifer as a liberator, and it can combine elements of, again, that rational and that theistic Satanism, but it tends to skew towards theistic. There are other groups and associated organizations as well, but we'll hold back on getting into all of those. The central premise of theological Satanism is a worship of Satan. I can't emphasize that enough, and an overt entertaining of evil. Now, we don't have exact numbers. How many theistic Satanists are there out there? I don't know. But the broader group of theistic Satanists is reported to be quite small. It may only be a few thousand around the world. We don't exactly know. But there are people who do follow Satan. This is a very real thing. And today, if you look at some of the outlets that cover this, they will say that most Satanists, again, and this goes back to those headlines, they're, quote, largely non-theistic. This is what history.com tells us, largely non-theistic. But I have covered stories, and we've done this on the show here, of people who were worshiping the devil and who later came to faith. So we know that this exists. There was ex-Satanist Brian Cole. You can listen to his story on the Playing with Fire podcast. As a little boy, he felt like he didn't belong anywhere, and he ended up spending more than 3 decades embroiled in the occult. He shared his story, really incredible story of finding Christ, and now he's sharing the gospel with others. Now, historically, satanic cults have existed in North America and in Europe as far back as the 17th century, but it goes even further back. There's a lot to really unpack there. There's a deep history there. And we know, again, going back to the Bible, that Satan is real, that he is present, that the demonic realm is real. And I think I need to underscore, regardless of what type of Satanism a person is adhering to, doesn't matter whether it's rationalistic/atheistic or whether it's theological in nature, an embrace of Satanism is a reject of Jesus. It's a reject of true faith. I think Got Questions probably had this most astutely noted when they said, quote, "The basic commonality in all the branches of Satanism is a promotion of self." So even without the overt belief in God or the devil, the persona and the attributes of Satan are being held up and heralded, and they're being held up as a sort of standard of how to live. So it doesn't really matter whether people believe in Satan or not. Just like Got Questions concluded in their analysis of this, quote, "The end result is the same. Their souls are in bondage to him." Now, there are other schools of thought out there, and we can get caught up in the mess and the mix of information, but we have to focus on the fact that the Bible tells us the devil is the father of lies, that he's bent on confusing and killing and destroying, and that any dabbling in this arena is spiritually dangerous. I want to leave you guys today with John 8:44. "You belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies." Today's Playing with Fire was a little different, exploring what this all looks like, what this all means. And I want to tell you guys, we are going to be back with part 2. We played part 1 on August 26th of our conversation with Jared and Petra Knott. They are Bible teachers who operate a deliverance ministry. We're going to be back with part 2 next week, but I wanted to give this explainer in the middle here because I think it's important we understand what we're reading in the headlines, who these people are, and what they believe. Thank you for listening to the Playing with Fire podcast. We will be back next week with another episode. You can head over to Amazon or wherever books are sold if you want to know more about these topics and grab the book. It's called Playing with Fire, a modern investigation into demons, exorcism, and ghosts.